Hello and welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin, joined as always by Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
I'm good, Andrew. I'm up in Northeast Poland right now, and we got a little mixed up on the times, right? Because they just changed time in Poland. I'm not sure for the whole of Europe, but you guys are still an hour ahead of us. So
I can never keep up with the time stuff, but here we are anyway. And whatever time it is, wherever you are, we're delighted that you're here listening with us, and we're especially delighted because Bobby and I are joined by our friend Larry Chapp today. Larry and Bobby and I are friends, and we've collaborated a little bit together here and there. And Bobby and I both share a kind of mutual admiration for Larry's incisive commentary on the church and the culture. And so we're excited to jump into that a little bit today with him in this new venture that we're embarking on, the Space Salvi Institute. Larry, I'd like to start with, we're not really a current events podcast, but we want to address the fact that you've just come back from Rome and you've written about the Synod on synodality. I love the piece that you published recently in Catholic World Report, talking about the wideness, kind of the theological wideness, which leads to theological shallowness, which is definitely something that I'm concerned about. So let's start there. What was Rome like, and what are your initial impressions, kind of as a theologian?
Well, Rome was Rome is my favorite city in the world, so it wasn't much of a burden for me to have to go there to report on the synod. That being said, though, it was exhausting. Meeting with a lot of different people, synod participants, other journalists, that kind of thing, just to get the sort of pulse. That's why I went there, not to just look at it from a distance, but kind of get a pulse of what's going on the ground there. And I think that I did, and my impressions overall, while there, simply confirmed what my fears had been before I went there, which is that the synod is largely an exercise in a Catholic progressive theology's attempt to once again alter church teaching by hook or by crook. That's sort of the nutshell of it. And so they have used a lot of language, very, very typical of the past 60 years, if you're familiar at all with progressive Catholic theology, of things like, inclusion, diversity, dialogue, listening. I mean, when I was growing up, inclusion and diversity weren't so big, but, dialogue and listening and not being rigid and open to the new things that the Holy Spirit is doing. I mean, these are bromides of the left, Catholic left, that have been around for a long time. And then there's simply code now, as they were code then, for we want to change the church's teaching, especially in areas of sexuality and gender. And they'll do whatever they need to do in order to accomplish that. And they haven't gone away. The pontificates of John Paul and Benedict notwithstanding, they're still there. And the pontificate of Francis seems to have re-empowered them, put them in charge of the synod, as a matter of fact. And so it's a false whiteness. That was the point to my piece. It's the same kind of language. But, for example, just to use one example, when they say, well, we need to be a listening church, listening to whom? Clearly, Pope Francis doesn't want to listen to the traditionalists, the people who love Latin Mass, the people who want to hold on to and retrieve certain traditions of the church. He doesn't want to listen to them. Why wasn't, instead of giving, for example, a papal audience private with Sister Janine Gramick of the dissenting New Ways ministry, why didn't he grant a private audience to the leaders of Courage, which is a very orthodox Catholic outreach to homosexuals? Why wasn't one of their members made a voting member of the synod? And you hear a lot of talk at the synod from people like Cardinal McElroy, Cardinal Supich, Cardinal Hollerich, about the need to listen to these LGBTQ voices, but it only seems to be one kind of LGBTQ voice. I don't mean to say that to pick on the gays, so to speak. They're always accusing people like me of this. But to point out that it's a strange kind of whiteness. It's no whiteness at all. It's actually a strange narrowness. And so there's a kind of Orwellian doublespeak going on. And I hate to be so negative, but I'm deeply cynical about the whole thing.
Yeah, and it seems to me, before, I know, Bobby, you want to jump in, but just last thing here before you do. It seems to me too, Larry, that even if something like the Synod on Synodality turns out to be what I noticed today, that Sohrab Ahmari published a piece calling it a big nothing burger. And maybe it is, maybe that's right. Like ultimately church teaching isn't going to change, but it just seems to me a lot of this stuff is just kind of bad for morale. It seems to kind of, take things that are very difficult and purport to deal with them just by sort of putting on an event, rather than like really rolling up our sleeves and realizing like we have a crisis in the West. We have a crisis at the center of the question of human anthropology. These meetings and these dialogues are fine, but they're not ever going to solve these problems. And the whole kind of wideness issue that then, as you say, kind of leads to this shallowness issue is precisely what we want to avoid. We need depth. We need focus,
Yeah, we do. I don't know if Bobby wants to say something before I chime in again.
Yeah, but like in response, very often when you stress the need for depth and to really mine the theological riches of the church, the people respond and they say, yeah, no, people are not interested in that stuff. We need the kind of listening sessions. I mean, I dealt with this so often when I was teaching in a Catholic high school, when you would try to say to the fellow teachers teaching theology, like, no, let's mine the riches of the church, and tell them, actually, I've seen it in the classroom. The students want this stuff. They've never seen something like an argument before, or they've never heard of, once you open up the first page of Augustine's Confessions, you can see the lights spark in their eyes. But very often they said, no, we need more activities. We need to hear their voice. But they really, like you said in your piece, Larry, you can't give what you don't have. They don't have that yet. Okay. And so experience is important, but yet they need to actually see like the form in order for the experience to be illuminated. So I don't know. I just find, great pieces, Larry, but I just find this really concerning.
And the thing is, it is very concerning because you mentioned the fact that they emphasize experience. So we need to listen to people's experiences. But even there, that's disingenuous. It's a load of risible nonsense, because whose experiences are they listening to? They privilege certain experiences over others, which shows that they have an ideological agenda already in play. Like I said, they don't want to listen to the experiences of Catholics like the three of us. I don't feel represented by that synod. I don't believe that most of the people that were at that synod represented my voice at all. And I don't feel like I was listened to. And I think millions and millions of Catholics feel the same way. So it was a very tendentious and selective kind of listening. We're going to hear what we want to hear, and we're going to keep listening and hearing what we want to hear until we hear what we want to hear. And the reason why I think this synod was a big nothing burger, but I think they intended it to be a big nothing burger. As Cardinal Supich said on the way home, the final synthesis document, it didn't have anything in it that a lot of people were expecting, but the document's not important. What was important was the event itself. And that is very reminiscent of how progressives co-opted Vatican II after the council, where they would say, well, don't quote documents to me, don't quote Lumen Gentium to me, don't quote Sacrosanctum Concilium to me, because the documents are unimportant. What's important is the event of the council, which then creates the spirit of Vatican II as a dynamic. That's at the essence of the so-called Bologna school of the interpretation of Vatican II as a rupture with the past. Mm-hmm. And the Bologna school, led by Cardinal Marini, would say, look, it doesn't matter what the council said. What matters was the dynamic it established, the processes of change it established. And then we ran with that. And that's my fear now between Synod number 1 and number 2 next year. I talked to some Synod members, and I won't mention their names, who said, pay very careful attention to what is going to happen in the next 11 months. Because this current synod was never intended to reach any conclusions. It was intended to set up a process and establish a buzz, establish a kind of dynamism that the next 11 months are going to push until we get to the next synod. So, well, it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting because who knows what it is that Pope Francis is ultimately up to here. As I said in my piece, I'm kind of done trying to figure out Pope Francis. I'll let other people do the math and connect the dots. All I care about are the people that are speaking clearly as to what it is that they think the Synod is about. And people like Cardinal Hollerich, Cardinal McElroy, that's very clear. Oh, we want women priests. Oh, we want LGBTQ normalization. That's what we want. So, kudos to them for being at least honest about what it is that they want. I don't think they're going to get it, but that's what they want.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes, Larry, when I heard that there was going to be a synod on synodality, I thought immediately that it sounded like some Kafka-esque, ruse. I mean, what a strange collection of words just in the description of what the thing is. But then, you get all these hot takes about this and that. And, I suppose there's one school that would say maybe this is some kind of four-dimensional chess on the part of Pope Francis himself, that, you sort of, as you say, it's just, it's about the event, and maybe you let some of these people talk and kind of get it out of the system, just kind of have a bit of a, have a bit of a listening session, put all these jargon words, slap them all on there, and just sort of see if we can skate through, this minefield or whatever, kind of crawl our way through this minefield of all the stuff that we're facing now in the world. But, maybe it's entirely likely I'm just not faithful enough or smart enough to trust, to trust processes or something like that. But it just seems to me we have so many bigger fish to fry in terms of not only the church, but how to talk to the culture too.
Oh, a bigger fish to fry. How about the sex abuse crisis?
Right.
How about Father Rupnik? How about the Vatican continuing to slow pitch anything to do with Father Rupnik? And Father Rupnik being simply the latest example of the current Vatican's soft peddling of the sexual abuse or the covering up of sexual abuse by people like Bishop Zanchetta and others. Or the Rupnik affair, as Chris Altieri's been writing about endlessly, is infuriating because it's the tip of a very large iceberg. I mean, it's the culmination of a series of missteps by this papacy on the issue of sexual abuse. And I mean, you guys can chime in on this. And like I said, like you said, this is not necessarily a podcast about current events, but is there a graver issue facing the church today, a more demoralizing issue, a festering issue that still hasn't been dealt with in the sex abuse crisis? Why didn't we get a synod on that? And what about the completely ongoing, irresolvable tensions in the liturgical life of the church? The ongoing and persistent desire by millions of Catholics for a more traditional form of the liturgy, which just gets summarily ignored. And it's a festering wound in the church. It's an ongoing wound in the church that has never been resolved. Why not have a synod on the liturgy? Parrhesia, where all voices are heard, including the so-called traditionalists and the Latin mass lovers. No, we get a meeting on meetings, which is absurd. And it's even Pope Francis, like a couple months ago, admitted in an interview, I don't remember with whom, it was widely reported though, where he says, I understand that for the average Catholic, the synod is uninteresting because it's so bureaucratic and navel staring by the church, but it's still important. No, it isn't. And it's never been important. It's never been important. And that's people say, why do you hate this? I don't hate the synod. I just think it's a complete irrelevance and a complete distraction and a complete waste of our time and money and energies as a church when there are so many other issues, which is precisely why I think it's never been about restructuring the governance of the church or about making the church more synodal in an Eastern style. The Eastern bishops are the first ones to say, what you're talking about has nothing to do with Eastern style synodality. It's not synodality at all. So they're throwing that word synod. It's like Princess Bride. You keep on using that word. I don't think you know what that means. I don't think they know what synodality even is. Just a buzzword. It's code for we are going to establish a process of listening to lay people that we are then going to curate and guide and facilitate in a very certain direction, then declare that this is the Holy Spirit speaking through the sensus fidelium, and then use that as a justification for changing basic doctrines of the church. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm saying that's what they really mean by synodality. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to engineer fake sensus fidelium. That's what they're trying to do and call it synodality.
I told my wife, she's like, what are you going to talk about with Larry Chapp? And I said, synodality, the synod, Magdalena. And she's she's like, maybe you could find something a little more interesting, not so boring. So yeah, I mean, and then I think we also asked my in-laws about that, and same thing. It just really,
Yeah, and no, in some sense it is boring. I keep saying on my blog posts and stuff, geez, I'm sick of doing this stuff on synodality. And yet, and I get a lot of emails from people saying, you've got your blog's gone off the rails. You used to write about theology and theological issues, and now all you're doing is, church chat all the time. But what I tell people, no, absolutely. My commentary on the synod is absolutely a central aspect of my blog. If you go back to why I started Gaudium et Spes 22, it was to promote and defend the ressourcement communio theology that animated the council and animated the papacies of John Paul and Benedict, the greatest theological movement since the medieval era, in my point of view, and it needs to be preserved, promoted, and retrieved. I see the synod as an attempt to dismantle that legacy. I see the progressives who are in the synod directly trying to dismantle, especially the legacy, the theological legacy of John Paul II. And therefore, it's of central concern to me, and it should be of central concern to every Catholic, that we not allow that to happen. Not this time, not again. We're not going to do another Spirit of Vatican II. We're not going to, and this time around, there are so many more media voices out there. It's no longer possible to simply to control the narrative by controlling 5 or 6 media choke points. That's why things like this and other venues are so important, that we get the message out. Not again. They're not going to get away with this again.
But Larry, really quickly, why is it that the ressourcement school just so attacked? I mean, and just also though, like as like a player, it just seems that this kind of more liberal progressive wing of theology is basic. It dominated most of the institutions. I mean, you went to Fordham. I went to St. Louis University. Bishop Barron used to talk about having to read Ratzinger,
clandestinely.
Yeah, and so I
literally, I was like a little kid in seminary with under my blanket with a flashlight reading Balthasar.
Yeah, but like anybody who's handed like, I'm not talking about like the really good stuff maybe there, but like comparing that to just the average communio or ressourcement thinker, it just doesn't compare. Why did it have to though? Like the only place I remember that was really doing like not ressourcement, but also representing communio was where Communio the journal was housed. It wasn't really
Washington.
So I mean, why is
that? Well, from the progressive Catholic point of view, it's easy. Progressive theology is wide and shallow. It doesn't really care about theology as such at all. For the most part, progressive Catholic theology was a conclusion in search of an argument. And the conclusion was that the wide boulevard of modern secular values are what's normative. And we need to bring the church into line with the normativity of those secular values. And whatever theology aids us in that project is good. And we're going to label as good. And any theology that impedes that is by definition reactionary, rigid, pharisaical, and backward. So the ressourcement theology got eclipsed because it continued to speak as if theology mattered to these people, as if theology mattered to the mass media that the liberals controlled. And so we kept spinning our theological stuff, and while the liberals took control of everything and were speaking in the language of pop sociology and pop psychology. And you're right. Now they're back in control of things again. And the reason why communio theology and folks like Bishop Barron have taken it on the nose from the radical traditionalists is because if you look at before Pope Francis came along, there weren't that many rad trads. They were mostly with the SSPX people. And what you had were simply conservative JP2 Catholics or very conservative JP2 Catholics. And they were all kind of on board with the communio ressourcement thing. They had no big problem with Vatican II or anything, but they got red-pilled by Pope Francis. And eventually, about 5 years into the Francis papacy, I think they all just said, we don't, it's very easy. It's a very lazy, but you can understand it. They simply said, scorched earth. We don't want, if Pope Francis and his guild represent Vatican II and the post-Vatican II church, we want nothing to do with it. And insofar as ressourcement communio theology is implicated in Vatican II, it gets caught up in that rejection. Sadly, most of the traditionalists who reject communio don't really know what it is. They've never read communio. They know Balthazar was Dare We Hope and stuff, and that's it. And so there's this kind of retreat that we need to go back to Garrigou Lagrange. We need to go back to like it was before. Of course, that's silly. You can't do that, but you can understand it. So I think, in a nutshell, that's the kind of dynamic of what's going on and why communio theology has really been eclipsed, and why there is a need for these kinds of conversations that we're having right now. I just had one this morning with a Father John Nepple, who's the vice rector at St. John Vianney Seminary in Denver. And he's just got a new book out. He's a ressourcement theologian. He has a new book out on Mary and the church. And I had a wonder, and he was apologizing for being a theology nerd and talking so many deep theological ideas. I said, no, be the nerd. We don't have enough theology nerds out there right now, because contrary to what people say, like the progressives, people do want theology. They want good theology. They really do.
You should get that on the shirt. Be the nerd.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't need a shirt to advertise that I'm a nerd.
Larry, I was thinking as you were talking, I'm going to kind of ramp up to my next question to you by saying this. I'm a convert to Catholicism, I guess, in quotes, a convert. I came into full communion with the Catholic Church from Protestantism. I was an Anglican minister for about 10 years. And, I like to say to people, I'll tell you about synodality if you'd really like to hear about it, from my Anglican background, where, I literally was in rooms where people were voting on, essentials of doctrine. But it's almost just kind of, what's the point? I can talk about that sort of thing, and people may listen or may not. But, I reflect on the things that were so compelling to me about coming into the church. It was definitely frustration with things like that drove me out. But far greater was the vision of the fullness of reality that the church offered, and that I think is so palpable in the communio stuff, in the Vatican II documents, in the work and the ministry of Pope Benedict, of Ratzinger, Benedict, and JP2, of course, as well. And, for these years that we have had Pope Francis as Pope, I came into the church during Pope Francis's pontificate, and I certainly haven't gone full black pill rad trad, and I'm certainly never going back to any kind of, liberal, progressive kind of spirituality. But I admit, I think there are people who are in a boat like the one I'm in, and a lot of cradle Catholics too, who they really do want to just be faithful Catholics, but keep running into these roadblocks and these walls. Yeah. And so, our project here at the Spe Salvi Institute, obviously we take our name from Pope Benedict's great eschatological encyclical. But, it's one of the important things for us is that the end, the eschaton, is what ought to inform our lived experience now. And so I guess this is all a big roundabout way of saying, maybe to throw it back to you, to start thinking in terms of hope. Like, I'm pretty confident that we're going to get through this. I try on my best days to just chalk up a lot of this nonsense to just kind of the last gasp of this kind of tired old thing, or just a kind of naivete maybe on the part of some of the people closest to Pope Francis or something. I don't know, benefit of the doubt kind of thing. But where, what kind of still makes you excited to be a Catholic, I guess, is one way to throw it back to you, to ask you.
Because, man, it's a wild ride for starters.
Yeah.
And what keeps me Catholic, and this is going to seem trite, is that it's true. That still excites me. But here's the deal. And everything, I was thinking, you're a former Anglican. I go to the Anglican Ordinariate parish, even though I'm a cradle Catholic, and largely because it feeds me liturgically and spiritually, and so I sought it out. But I really think that it's true that if the church is simply going to, I'm very hopeful. I'm extremely hopeful about the future of the church. Maybe not in my lifetime, but down the road. And here's why. The fact is, if the church is going to emulate secular culture, which is what progressives want to do and just drift along, what is secular culture today is religious indifferentism and religious relativism. And so if you're going to emulate that, you're kind of committing institutional suicide. And you see that wherever liberal Protestant churches have emulated the culture, they commit institutional suicide because you've adopted religious relativism and indifferentism in adopting the culture. Therefore, the only form of Catholicism that's going to survive, just as you see in the Protestant churches, are forms of ecclesial existence that offer people a real alternative to the culture. And there are going to be various levels of sanity and insanity to those alternatives. But we have to build, and this is Bishop Barron's thing, right? We have to build attractive alternatives to the dominant culture. And they have to be attractive. They can't just be freakish, right-wing, let's go build a Catholic compound kind of thing. It has to be a real alternative. How you do that is going to be left up to the genius of sanctity, the genius of saints and doing that. But I'm very hopeful that, so in some ways we have this really unique opportunity that's confronting us, because in a lot of ways, what all of this that we're seeing today represents is, in my view, the death rattle of a certain kind, still clinging, of a certain kind of Constantinian form of the church, this sort of accommodation between the church and the dominating culture, which was fine as long as the church dominated the culture. But then long after the church didn't dominate the culture, it still wanted to play nice and make nice with this dominant culture. And it hasn't worked. It really hasn't worked. And what we're seeing is the kind of death rattle of that kind of status quo, Western style, bourgeois, suburban Catholicism, whatever you want to call it, what Barron calls beige Catholicism. It's the death rattles of that. I think you're right about that. And therefore, there's going to be a painful, as Ratzinger pointed out in 1968, right? There's going to be a painful shrinking of the church. We're going to lose members. We're going to hemorrhage people. And there's just practically no way to stop that. The barn doors are already open. The horses have left. So we have to simply be about the business of knowing who we are, doubling down on knowing who we are, building communities of sanctity and love and care and compassion and faith and truth and beauty and goodness and all those things, and just stick with it and let then the real movement of the Holy Spirit, not people sitting around round tables in the Paul VI Hall, the real movement of the Holy Spirit suddenly raise up for us new St. Benedict's, new St. Francis's, new Thomas Aquinas's, to show us via their sanctity how we're going to negotiate what it means to be a Catholic in the world today. There's really, in many ways, no way to know in advance what that's going to look like. We can have, certain parameters. The church is always going to have the same basic structures, but, what form it takes, culturally speaking, this is what jazzes me up. This is why I started a Catholic worker farm. There's some real mojo, baby, going on out there in the church. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not. There's some really great, exciting people doing exciting things in the church, and that gives me hope.
Yeah. And all the people, even at the John Paul II Institute in DC, when you meet all those people, you see, it's like a creative, minority, and the people are so compelled by the faith, not only because it's true, but I mean, it literally is just such a source of beauty that it inspires them to really counteract the kind of boredom that you find everywhere in society. I love that you stress, was it the Bernanos? Is it Bernanos from the Diary of a Country Priest?
Yeah.
Just
George
looking
Bernanos.
out at a bored church.
It's the opening page of the book.
Yeah.
My parish is bored stiff like all the rest, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. That's how Bernanos opens the novel. And this is 1936.
Yeah. But you mentioned too, there's not a damn thing we can do about it. I remember whenever Dr. Schindler, deceased, Dr. Schindler,
David L.
Schindler, a lot of the students would always, complain to him, well, what do you want us to do? And what should we do to change things? And he said, he simply said, take a vow, just take a vow. And I thought that was the best response you could.
That is a great response. What did he mean by that? Did he elaborate? I'd like to know.
Well, actually, I heard his son retell that story once. And
DC.
he meant like commit yourself, like, yeah, DC. In this, it's kind of like Balthazar's Christian States of Life book, a
Yeah,
little bit,
yeah,
where it's just like, commit yourself in a way to obedience, chastity, and poverty, whether that's in marriage or in the consecrated life, and that radical way of life of when you bind yourself completely to another,
absolutely.
is actually enough. One, because my concern is, like, often in these discussions we can talk about great theology, and that will do enough to like move people,
Yeah.
we need that, but at the same time, you need like people who have like this living presence of the Lord in them by their way of life. They're so in the
Yeah.
Spirit that you
Great theology is necessary, but it's not sufficient.
yeah
And what you're describing is what's not sufficient about it. You've got to go on into and I write about this all the time, into the realm of the universal cult to holiness, into sanctity. And the reason why I was so curious what Schindler meant by that is that there is a line in Balthazar, I can't remember where now, I'd have to look it up, where Balthazar says, love always takes the form of a vow. And so any culture and any society and any church that runs around saying, that love is the opposite, all right, love means the dissolving of the ties that bind in order for us to be truly free, in order to pursue our libidinous desires, that is the opposite. And so, yeah, I think that's another way is just of saying, vow to something is another way of saying is be an alternative. Be an alternative to that, to the silliness and superficial. We tend to, I think, underplay how unattractive modernity is to most people, how bored they are, how dead inside they feel. And so if we can represent the faith to them, but the faith has got to be represented in a way that's fresh and new somehow, some way, because there is this sense in the air among many people that they don't even want to consider the church because, been there, done that, tried that. They had their day in the sun and they blew it. And that's just so, centuries ago. It's like when a Jehovah's Witness comes to our door and we thank you, and we shut the door because, I don't want their stupid comic book, because I know in advance that their religion is dumb. And I'm not saying Catholicism is dumb, but we need to understand that that's the way so many of our contemporaries view Catholicism, the same way we look at a Jehovah's Witness or a Mormon when they come to the door. Yeah. All right. And so we have to find a way to stop passing out the comic book. We got to figure out a way to sort of shock therapy or something, where we've got to really shake the dust off of this institution and do something truly exciting, unique, novel, energizing.
Yeah. It seems to me, Larry, that it's not only that we project this, we project onto others the idea that our faith is just kind of the option that we have chosen among many, but we think of that for ourselves. We think of the church as just kind of, in our opinion, man, like the biggest and best denomination, and maybe you ought to be a part of it or whatever. But, rather than thinking of it as, and this is to come back to kind of the communio thing and Vatican II. To me, like when I read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, when I was pouring through that, contemplating coming into the church, it was clear to me that I wasn't just like reading a rule book. I wasn't just reading sort of the book, that prescribes everything that I have to sign up to, but rather it's the book that describes reality. And therefore, that's the compelling vision that I want. And this relates to something that I know in my mind anyway, to something that I know you've written a lot about, which is the kind of just de facto atheism or idolatry that we all walk around with. And it seems to me that, whether we're talking about, how to reinvigorate the institution or how to speak to the culture, that's really the big obstacle that we need to face in each one of us. So I don't know if you've thought more about that lately or have any fresh ideas.
I have. I believe it was Charles Péguy, who said that modern Christianity is characterized by believers who don't believe anymore. And that's very similar to what Ratzinger said in 1958 in his famous bombshell article in Hochschild, the new heathenism or the new paganism in the church, where he flat out said, What the church is today is a bunch of people who think they're Christians and they're not. They're really pagans. And I've sort of riffed on that and say, in essence, what we have in the church are a group of de facto atheists, and I would include many in the hierarchy and the clerical ranks in that. And I say that in some ways non-judgmentally, because I also like to say that I'm a leper preaching to other lepers. We're all infected with the bacillus of modernity, whether we like it or not. There's no way you can completely rise above the plausibility structures of your culture. And so there is this sort of nihilistic, atheistic impulse that our culture has planted within all of us that requires real effort and real work and real spiritual energy to overcome. Most Catholics have developed a sort of attenuated, weakened version of Pascal's wager that governs their spiritual life, where they have this de facto atheism within it, but they decide to do a sort of whistling past the graveyard spirituality of, well, let's hedge my bets. And after all, church is good for the kids. So they need some kind of morality or something. But it's not really a vibrant, deep faith, and it gives way at the first provocation. Therefore, Rahner was correct. The Christian of the future is going to be a mystic, or they won't be a Christian at all. And Balthazar had similar things to say. Ratzinger, you see a lot of people saying this same thing, that you're going to see a pruning away of those de facto atheists in the church, and what you're going to be left with are people. I'm trying to avoid the term intentional Catholics because I don't like it, but that's what I mean.
Yeah, I know you want to jump in, Bobby. I'll just say this real quick. Everything you're saying there, Larry, is a reminder to me of how, yes, on the one hand, we absolutely want to try to create these structures in our own lives that can kind of serve this formative function in the absence of a culture that could do that for us. But something that Bobby and I are both pretty interested in, and that our project is focusing on a little bit, is also trying to highlight in our cultural heritage, and maybe even in certain aspects of like certain marks that remain in kind of the remnant of Western Christendom, that we can sort of draw out again, and kind of, not that we're trying to be antiquarians, or we're not trying to kind of live in the past or anything like that, but what we are trying to say is it is good for the culture to have these formative elements in it, and we want to build those up again to some degree. And not only, we want to do this in tandem with the idea that we have to build these kind of parallel structures, I suppose.
Yeah, that's why I'm not a huge fan of Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option. Rightly or wrongly, I think wrongly mostly, but it's been interpreted as a kind of let's flee into the Catholic compound kind of thing. And I think there are elements in that book that lend itself to that. I prefer the statement by the Villanova professor Eugene McCarraher, whose wonderful book, The Enchantments of Mammon. Towards the end, he says, we don't need a Benedict option, we need a Francis option. And he didn't mean Pope Francis, he meant Saint Francis, because Saint Francis didn't just retreat into a monastery. Saint Francis, the whole mendicant thing was the fusion of monastic with going out into the world. And that's what McCarraher meant. And then Dorothy Day understood that, and we're sort of committed to that. Yeah, this is not a flee to the hills thing. It's we build intentional communities in order to engage the world. But in order to engage the world, you first have to know who you are, and you have to have a strong base out of which to operate. But it can never be insular, and it can never become self-referential. That's not the essence of the gospel, right? Can you imagine if the first apostles had simply said, well, we're just going to go into Judea and start a little Jesus compound, to hell with the, and we're going to await the end of the world, to hell with the rest. No, they went out into the world. There is a missionary mandate. Not that monks don't have a missionary. Look, Teresa of Lisieux, patron saint of missionaries. But you get my point. There's got to be an engagement with the world.
Well, we see this.
Go ahead.
No. I'm just saying, like you mentioned Francis, and I'm thinking of the Franciscans in Krakow. The Franciscan church is like pretty much almost in the very, you have the Franciscans and the Dominicans in like the very center of of the city. And there's kind of like this, almost in the sense that it's like the almost the base of the city around which almost everything is kind of being shaped. But what Andrew and I are trying to do is to see, well, even also in Europe, you still have more or less, maybe it's not like a fully lived reality, but things even like the cities, you're still in the structure of that world. And so for people like Andrew and me, like, we're Americans, right? We come and we see this for the first time, and we want to say, hey, look at what you have. And in some ways, perhaps you're maybe kind of living this out like unknowingly more than maybe even the Catholics in other cultures who are more intentional with their faith than you are.
Yeah.
But drawing from that is kind of like, you want to say like these plausibility structures, but yet there's also these other structures that, like Matthew Crawford says in his book, The World Outside Your Head, act kind of like a jig in which they in a way make you think like, okay, well, if these pilgrimage routes are all around my country, yet nobody's walking there now, yet it's there, it's still there. And there might be one person who's taking that up. And that's enough of a witness. So we're hoping to take some of that and help people, also bring some of that within the really like concrete world of America.
Because I'm a resolute opponent of the idea that the culture is lost, to hell with it. Let's just cut our losses, retreat to our compounds, like I said, and I do think there's an element of that kind of thinking in the Benedict option, and especially among people that it's like, look, we need to engage the culture, but essentially it's a lost cause. It's a waste of time. Let's just write it off. No, we can't write it off. And the fact is, the gospel is true and human nature hasn't changed. And there are still deep, deep, deep reservoirs of spiritual thirst in the culture that's out there, and deep reservoirs of goodness, beauty, and so on in that culture. Even something, for example, I'm giving a speech at the University of Scranton on Thursday, and I'm not quite done with it yet, but the part I'm working on right now is precisely on this topic. And if you look, for example, even at like critical theory, critical race theory, and so on, we can lament it and we say, what a crock of pagan nonsense, and blah, 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 and get all Republican and right wing about it. It's a horrible thing. This is in our schools. But the fact is, critical race theorists are essentially calling the bourgeois Enlightenment project a pile of nonsense. And they're looking at it, they reach wrong conclusions. Yes, class warfare, all that kind of stuff. But they're not wrong to point out that the Enlightenment, in the name of freeing ourselves from the oppression of religion, has created one of the most oppressive cultures in the history of the world. And as it created massive forms of oppression of various groups over the past 400 years, sponsored some of the greatest genocidal wars, spawned the race-based slave trade, and so on. And so you can look at, where my point is, you can look at critical race theory and you can say, well, that's a horrible thing and I'm not going to talk about it. Or you can sit down and you can say, you guys have a point, but here's where you go off the rails, I think. And here's where Christ provides us with a better, and his cross provides us with a better understanding of the agonistic elements and suffering in human history, because that's essentially what critical theory is pointing to, is that history has been largely agonistic, a tale of oppression and suffering, what Girard would call a tale of scapegoating and mimetic desire. And I can point to that and say, you are right about all of that, but here's where Christ gets it better. And of course, words aren't always going to do it, but we can build structures of discourse and engagement with people in our culture on that side of things, even when we resolutely disagree on more topical sort of hot button issues. So all is not lost. People are people, and there's a deep goodness in almost everybody, unless you're some sort of serial murdering, pathological, mentally ill person.
And we don't expect any such people are listening to the podcast right now. Bobby, any final words, any final questions for Larry before we sign off for the day?
Well, I just want to follow up Larry's comment on critical race theory, and also I thought of the dialectics of the Enlightenment, which Pope Benedict XVI in Spe Salvi mentions Theodore Adorno, one of the authors of that book. And so I encourage everybody, because there's a great commentary on the Enlightenment in Spe Salvi. So take a look at that. It's paragraph 22. 22. So,
I'll go back and reread it myself because I remember it now. And so that's great.
Well, speaking of 22, if any of you are unfamiliar with Larry Chapp's work, you can check out his website, Gaudium et Spes 22, named after the one of the constitutions from Vatican II. Larry writes regularly for all kinds of places, Catholic World Report. He's got a great book out not too long ago from Ignatius Press. And Larry's just one of the shining lights and a good friend. So Larry, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Oh, thank you. You guys are good for my ego, so that's good.
Well, you're good. You're good for us and for everyone listening, no doubt. If you liked what you heard here today from the Spe Salvi Institute podcast, please do give us a 5-star review, share it with a friend of yours, and check out our website, spesalviinstitute.com. Sign up for our email so you never miss anything new. Until next time, God bless you. We live in hope.